Hello, this is Ken Stuzen. I'm a partner at Brown Advisory. Welcome to the Now Podcast. Now stands for navigating our world. Through these discussions, we try to understand the world better, to navigate some of the most pressing questions that are shaping our lives, our culture, and our investment challenges. In this episode, which was recorded live at our Now conference in Austin, Texas, shortly after the U.S. election, you're going to hear from two thoughtful and experienced foreign policy experts. Emily Harding from the Center for Strategic and International Studies and Sir Robin Niblett from Chatham House will take us on a round-the-world tour of the potential risks, alliances, and power dynamics that could define global order over the near and long term. In a time of great unpredictability and a new U.S. administration, it's helpful to have serious thinkers like Emily and Robin to guide us. As you'll hear in this conversation, moderated by James Harding of Tortoise Media, they offer unsettling but also illuminating insights. I hope you enjoy their conversation.
2024, at the start of it, was billed as the year of democracy. If you remember, everyone started out the year talking about what might happen in India or in France or in South Africa or in my country, the UK, but nothing mattered as much as the election in the United States. And trying to understand the impacts it's going to have on the world is the job of this first session. Because I think that people across the United States and all around the world are recognizing that serious politics is back, that democracy was asked, how does it make sense for people of the economies that they're facing, and how does it make sense of the security concerns that they have? And it feels as though we have a serious set of questions before us, and we couldn't have two more serious thinkers to help us. There may be a great deal of uncertainty in the world, but I should say not for these two. For Emily and for Robin, as you'll discover, life is going to get very, very busy, I suggest, in 2025. Emily Harding worked in the White House, worked at the CIA, is now at CSIS and leads their team on technology and national security. Sir Robin Niblett ran Chatham House, the UK's leading, and I would say Europe's leading think tank on foreign policy. And I'm delighted that you're both here. We're going to try and do something which is quite improbable in the 45 minutes we have. We're going to try and circumnavigate the issues of the world, but I'm going to start, Emily, by asking you to try and put in place, if you like, a context, a framework for thinking about what happened on Tuesday last week.
Sure. I'm glad that you started off with the 2024 being the year of democracy, because what we're facing right now is a world that is really deeply unsettled. There are several places where conflict stands on a knife edge. The U.S. election, perhaps the most consequential of those elections, but there are several places around the globe where there are conflicts or there are friction that really could go either way. And the decisions that the U.S. makes, the decisions that our allies make in the next few months are really going to tip that balance one way or the other in a really consequential way. So before we do our global tour, I want to zoom out for just a second and point out three trends that deeply concern me about this particularly fractured moment in our globe. Number one, we're seeing an increasing alignment between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. At times, these have been marriages of convenience. More and more, it's looking like it's a real collaboration and that they each owe each other something, some kind of long-term alliance that could really form into an axis that we talk about. Number two, the possibility of polycrisis. The U.S. is no stranger to trying to manage multiple crises on the world stage at once, but the future that we're facing right now could turn into one where you have a major global crisis in multiple places around the world that really strains the resources, strains the attention span, and you have to make very difficult decisions about what you're going to tackle and in what order. Dana asked me, for the session, talk about what keeps you up at night. My big nightmare is that at some point, Russia wins in Ukraine and then makes a feint into Europe to make space for China to do whatever it wants to do in the Pacific. And that is a very difficult position for the United States to be in. And then finally, the consequences of these things is a potential arms race. You're going to see Europe, I think, realizing they have to stand on their own and really stepping up. You're going to see parts of Asia realizing they may have to stand on their own and really stepping up. The defense industrial base is not ready for that, and they're going to have to get ready very quickly. But what could happen there is either a united we stand or a divided we fall moment. If it's united we stand, then maybe France decides that it's going to focus on land battles and Germany decides it's going to focus on air battles and they're going to collaborate. If it's divided we fall, then everybody races ahead trying to defend their own borders and no one element is really strong enough to stand up to an alliance between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. So how do you navigate that? How do you build trust in that world so that we do have a united we stand atmosphere moving forward into 2025? With that, let's tour the globe.
Whoa, we're 4 minutes in. That's quite a lot to take on board. 4 minutes in, we've got a global arms race. All right, let's. The reason I think it's useful to try and track it is that there's so much going on. And the polycrisis point, Emily, is right. These things all intersect. Robin, can we start with the idea of the West? And I suppose there are two fundamental questions posed by the coming presidency of Donald Trump. One is tariffs, and the other is NATO. From Europe's point of view, what do you think the US-European relationship is going to look like?
Well, thanks very much, and pleasure to be here with this Brown Advisory Now conference. I'm back with you, James, as well, and with Emily. I used to work at CSIS, so it's great to be here. How does Europe look at this? With deep anxiety. You could argue the Trump presidency could not have arrived at a worse time for European governments. France, Macron, president, had just found his sort of mojo and was trying to lead a much more united European approach to Ukraine in particular, but has now received a real drubbing in the last elections. The German government, as you know, just collapsed. They've called for a coalition, has called for an election in February. And more fundamentally, the whole European economic model, which relied on a strong Germany at its core, is now threatened from two fronts simultaneously. The one they thought they were facing, in particular, which is the rise of China as a competitor in their own backyard on high-end manufacturing, including cars, machine tools, railways, etc. And just starting to get Europe to coordinate responses that would be collective to the China threat. But now, on the other side, there's a risk that a US that's always, even under Biden, thought a little bit about Americans first, if not America first. The Inflation Reduction Act was seen as a slightly aggressive move, as I think many of you will know, in Europe. But Donald Trump will put that to the shade. And I think we ought to remember that if you put the G7 countries together, excluding the US, they run a larger trade surplus with America than China. And we know the one thing that drives Donald Trump completely batty is, America running trade deficits. And to run it with allies, from his point of view, is almost worse, because, the allies are treating you as suckers. So the fear at the moment in Europe is that you're going to get an America that's going to turn on Europe economically, precisely at the time when they're weak politically, weak in the face of a new China threat. I haven't even mentioned Ukraine.
So can we come to that in 1 second?
Park that for a second.
Come to that in 1 second, Robin. I just want to test one thing. As you say, I think overwhelmingly the press response, the public responses have been anxiety in Europe. But do you detect curiosity or even enthusiasm for the idea of continental economies? And what I mean by that is a question about whether Robert Lighthizer might have a point, whether or not actually what the Europeans call strategic autonomy might be good for Europe, given, as you say, Germany's economy is on its back, France is struggling. Might there be some enthusiasm for this that we're not quite admitting to ourselves yet?
I think there's a difference between accepting that some of the points Donald Trump has made and Bob Lighthizer in his own way, about European free riding on American security is undoubtedly true. And the idea that Europeans in particular need to step up, invest more in their own security, as the reasons Emily was noting, and the risks that are there, and that actually, if the Europeans who spend roughly 4 times as much on defense as Russia today, even after Russia has increased its defense budget by over 50% in the last few years, in the last couple of years, the problem is that that would presuppose a capacity to respond cogently to the moment. And the fear at the moment is that Europeans aren't ready. Mario Draghi, the former Italian prime minister, former governor of the European Central Bank, just put out a big report, and it's all about building European champions, by the way. You know, Europe has to get a sort of continental scale economy to compete with China and to resist, should we say, some of the potential bullying that might come from a Trump administration. But which is the government that's going to step up and do that right now? You know, you've got some governments who think Trump's election is a good thing and are interpreting it for political reasons. Britain, which would be a natural partner to try to help midwife that transition, of course, is outside the EU right now and not able to be inside it and be a constructive player. So theoretically, yeah, it should be a moment of excitement, a moment to step up, a moment to respond. In practice, this is going to be a very difficult year, I think, for Europe.
Emily, can I ask you about NATO? I was talking to Susan Glasser of The New Yorker last week, and she said, based in Washington, of course, she said, look, as far as she's concerned, NATO is now a dead letter. Article 5 is a dead letter. The idea that the United States will step in for the collective security of its members, no NATO member should depend on that. Is that fair? Is that true?
I think that's probably an exaggeration. I mean, Trump has been very clear how he feels about European free riders, in Robin's words, and how he wants Europe to step up and try to carry its own weight. In 4 years last go-round, he did not actually pull out of NATO, which gives me some hope that he wouldn't try to do it this time around. I also think it's entirely possible that if something were to happen, like let's say that nightmare scenario comes true and Russia takes a big step into Poland, or Russia takes a big step into Finland, or Russia takes a big step into Estonia, that Trump would hem and haw and whine about it, but would, I think, actually step up and try to assist. I think the bigger push there is that he's going to say, we're not going to do it all for you. The support would be limited more than it would be the aggressive kind of umbrella that we would have seen in the past.
Robin, let's turn to Ukraine. In the months ahead of the election, Mike Pompeo was doing the rounds, particularly in European capitals, and what Europeans were hearing was that President Trump would come in and the deal was clear. Russia keeps what it's got, and the Ukrainians have to settle on those terms, otherwise they won't get further significant military assistance. Is that what you expect happens?
Personally, I think we're heading to something like that, even if Biden-Harris had won, by the way. I think we're heading inevitably to a position in 2025 where it is not possible for the Ukrainians to take back territory, and it is possible that the Russians can gain a bit more. And from President Putin's standpoint, he has annexed 4 entire provinces of Ukraine into Russia. I haven't quite defined the borders, but theoretically they're annexed. But he only controls one of them. So from his point of view, there's more to take. But despite the progress they've been making in these last few months, reputable estimates estimate they're losing 1,200 casualties a day. Russian casualties. Now, that doesn't mean all dead and badly injured. 1,200 a day, the highest in 2.5 years of war, right now. Now, the problem is they're paying folks $60,000 a year, signing bonuses. They've still got people coming forward. But is it sustainable that they could push that further and further? I don't think so. I think Putin is looking for a way out that lets him get as much as what he wanted. And the Europeans are getting to the point where they know, especially without strong American support, they're not going to be able to help Ukraine much longer. Ukrainian public opinion is leeching support from the idea that they need to keep fighting endlessly. So a deal would have been done of some sort, I think, in 25, whoever had won. The thing about Trump is he's majored on it, and in a way the Ukrainian government have to kind of take what comes in his direction. The problem is twofold. If there's a deal, Ukraine can be, I'll pick my words carefully, sustainably sovereign in 80% of its territory. It can survive. Yeah? It's got the port of Odessa, it's got the bulk of its territory, it can survive. But it can't survive, it's going to think that at any moment that could be the next stretch. If America's not going to be there to prevent it, the Europeans have to step up, put skin in the game with military support. They're providing financial support, but at some point they're probably going to have to turn some of their bilateral security guarantees, given that NATO membership, I think, is not going to happen for as far forward as I can see. And so they're going to have to step up, maybe put troops on the ground, not in combat roles, but something there to demonstrate real commitment. So what I'm thinking is you could see Trump negotiate a deal, but delivery of the deal and its credibility, and for the Ukrainians to accept it, again, Europeans have to step up.
Emily, will you just take that on? Because I think it's hard to describe how frightening it is, the thought of 10,000 North Korean soldiers effectively fighting on European soil, a war between Russia and Ukraine. I was really struck by your Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, kind of not quite an alliance, but an alignment. What does Make America Great Again mean in foreign policy terms? How much will the United States be willing to step in and defend that 80% of Ukraine, push back on the North Koreans? What's happened to that sole superpower?
Yeah, I'm about to say a lot of things that I really hate. I'm just going to preface this. The part of me that's an intelligence analyst by training has an answer to that question. The part of me that's a policymaker really hates the answer to that question and would take it a totally different direction. So I think the actual answer is that the U.S. is not going to do as much as we should. We're going to be drawing back. I'm going to disagree with Robin a little bit in that I think that Putin and Russia are going to be willing to pour a lot more resources into this before they accept what they would view as a bad deal. I also think that Putin thinks that he can play Trump and that he can squeeze every last inch of concessions out of the U.S. and out of Europe because the U.S. and Europe are divided. And I think he thinks that he can just get away with it. Like, he's managed to keep public opinion enough on sides that he can keep pouring in these resources. And with the North Koreans, that if I were a Russian and the North Koreans were operating on my territory, I would be terrified of that. And the fact that, well, this is the policymaker hat again, the fact that the U.S. isn't screaming from the high heavens, show us what they're doing over there. They can't be behaving themselves, so show us what's actually going on the ground inside Russia. Where I think this gets really sticky is that Ukraine cannot win a war of attrition. They just can't. Russia can pour so much more into it than Ukraine can, and with the West not giving Ukraine enough where they can actually win, you're in this really uncomfortable, basically a stalemate, where Ukraine is losing faster than they're winning. The alternative then is a deal. And if you get a deal, then what happens to, what was your phrase, sustainably sovereign? Yeah, in that 80% of the territory. The Europeans will say, well, we offer them a path to NATO membership. Really? You're going to offer somebody whose 20% of their territory is occupied by Russia the NATO Article 5 umbrella? You can't. You are at war the instant that they sign the piece of paper. So, okay, so maybe it's a path to NATO membership, maybe it's a security guarantee. Who's enforcing that security guarantee? I can't see Trump doing it. I can see the Europeans thinking about doing it. I also can't see Zelensky actually signing up for a deal like that. So you're probably looking at a leadership transition in Ukraine in addition to this huge concession of territory. I mean, as an intelligence analyst, the answer that I hate is that I see this playing out in a way where Ukraine is a shadow of its former self, where Russia can really claim victory, and then now Russia owes China their allegiance for helping them out on this front.
Okay, we're moving towards China, but speaking of regions where people wish the neighbors would step in, but they look at the problem and think it's too hard to fix, let's do the Middle East. So, Emily, you're just back from there, right? What do you think what would Benjamin Netanyahu's sensible read be on Donald Trump's victory?
It's good news. It's good news for Benjamin Netanyahu. So he's right. I just got back from a week-long trip to Israel where the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, were our tour guides, basically, and they took us up to the north to the border with Lebanon, which got a little hot and spicy. And then we went down to the south and went into Gaza and to the Rafah crossing, and you could see the devastation there. We were actually in Israel on Election Day as the results were coming in, and they were optimistic but wary. They, I think, understand that Donald Trump can be unpredictable and that his alliances one day may not be his alliances the next day. They also know that Donald Trump hates Iran almost as much as Netanyahu does, and that he and Bibi are friends. So there's an opportunity, I think, for them to really push forward in trying to accomplish some more of their goals, tactically, perhaps strategically. If Donald Trump needed a reason to go after Iran, he was handed one last week with the indictments about the assassination attempts. I think that Israel will probably play that card to say, you know, we're here minding the shop in the Middle East, and you know, you should support what we're up to, so that we can continue to mind the shop in the Middle East.
And Emily, did you come away? I mean, it's interesting listening to you both talk about Ukraine. No obvious end in sight. Israel, Gaza, Lebanon, Iran, even more so?
Right. So I will tell you that the Israelis think that they are settling in for a long war. What I heard from them last week was that they think it'll take about another year to finish moving Hamas out of Gaza. And Gaza, I mean, it's devastated. It's heaps of concrete right now. That's it. And they think it'll be another year before they can clear out the remnants of Hamas and then close up the tunnels. In the north, they don't know. They really don't know. If you talk to them about the day after, there's some sort of hand waving about, well, we're sending in humanitarian aid, and well, you know, maybe the Palestinian Authority will be able to come in and take charge. But this is going to be one of those situations where no one wants to own this problem. No one does. And so Israel's going to be the only one who ends up owning it.
Can I ask you, Robin, to look beyond Israel to Iran? And although this is a very unpopular view, there are some who say you're coming towards the end of the leadership of a current Ayatollah. There is instability economically, politically, and, if you like, religiously. There's a moment now. And certainly there are some around Netanyahu who clearly think that. There are some in the incoming US administration, I expect, who think that. Is it possible to drive a change of regime in Iran externally?
A simple answer from my perspective would be no, externally. Unless it ended up looking something like the regime we've got now. In other words, you actually were manipulating people within the system. And then you had a cosmetic change, which nonetheless gave you some leverage. I'd imagine that's something you can do. But the idea that you'd move to democracy, or something approximating a democracy from the outside, I think is highly unlikely. Could you get some change of leadership that was suitably profound? Maybe. I think the more interesting thing here, and we were just discussing beforehand, I was in Abu Dhabi last week, similarly watching the election from abroad. If you're in Saudi right now, everything is about Vision 2030. It's about how am I going to supply jobs, opportunity, economic growth to a rapidly growing young population who love Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, because he has introduced new social reforms and is giving people a sense of opportunity for their future. But the way I've always thought about it is each new hydrogen plant, each new tourist destination, each new petrochemical, each NEOM, each grand, gargantuan project is a new part of the target list for the IRGC, for Revolutionary Guard. You can't do Vision 2030 and be at war with Iran. And one of the most interesting things of the last week was this joint little naval patrol. The Saudis and Iranians did a joint naval patrol in the Persian Gulf. What the hell? Around the time of Trump's election. So one of the big differences between Trump coming in 25 and coming in 2017 is that the focal point now in the Gulf is not Iranian nuclear deals and how we must destroy the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA. It is, please, we're focused on economic growth. Please don't escalate. They're very happy. certainly in Abu Dhabi, I'd imagine in Riyadh as well, with Hamas being eviscerated. They're happy with Hezbollah, Shia troublemakers being destroyed, but that doesn't mean they want escalation with Iran. And again, I'm not going to try to second guess the Trumpian way of thinking about this, but it's a very interesting change dynamic. So Israel is probably going to be left in its space, trying to fix or not fix, get safe there. And I can give one little statistic on this, a polling number. The last poll I saw, there are 20% of Israelis who now think a two-state solution is a good idea. 40% and over, 43%, think Israel should annex the entire West Bank and basically give whatever second-right citizens to Palestinians. Double, want to annex the West Bank. In a way, Israel is going to be focused, I think, in its region, but the idea that it can then manipulate this moment to escalate to Iran, it just seems a stretch to me.
Emily, in the world that we're describing or discussing, what should the relationship between Washington and Riyadh be?
There's definitely a divided view here. There is great acknowledgement in Washington that Mohammed bin Salman is a dictator and has very little by way of desire to build a thriving democracy that respects human rights in Saudi Arabia. On the other hand, he has made strides in a good direction rather rapidly for a country like Saudi Arabia. Women have slightly more rights than they used to. I still would not feel comfortable walking down the street by myself in Riyadh, certainly not looking like this. Tried that, it doesn't go well. I will say too that he is going to be around for a very long time. He's young. We're going to be dealing with this guy for the next 60 years. So we might as well develop a relationship with him, encourage him down the road that he's on, try to push for the kinds of human rights adjustments that are needed. And then frankly, what you really don't want is a reasonably near future where we're in kind of a push away from oil. You don't want a poor, young, radical Saudi Arabia sitting out there as a potential threat. So, I think bite your tongue a little bit, take your medicine, push forward with the relationship.
Well, I was talking to David Petraeus, General Petraeus, the week before last time. He said one of his rules of the Middle East is that it's not Vegas. What happens there doesn't stay there. So I thought it was a
that's accurate.
About it.
Yep.
Robin, outside, I hope when people leave, they'll pick up a copy of Robin's most recent book, which looks at the relationship between the US and China. Robin, I hope you won't mind. You'd rather give the game away in the title, The New Cold War. Do you think that's more likely, this Cold War, with the election of Donald Trump?
My net position right now is the relationship is likely to get worse rather than better. I'm not saying we're going to some cataclysmic position. And I say net because obviously there's two sets of forces playing within, at least within an upcoming Trump administration. The forces of pragmatism, John Paulson, Scott Bessent, Steve Schwartzman, I imagine, people on the financial side who say, look, the tariff thing is going to be disastrous for America and we need to find a way to get on and let's escalate to de-escalate, all of that kind of language. But then, of course, as always, with the Trump administration, you then see the other set of appointments. So Marco Rubio, who's had, been very critical of China since before it was popular, 5 or 6 years at least. And obviously Mike Waltz, who's maybe been much tougher on it, as members of Congress are, and which are animated, and this is a very important element, which is why I think there is an aspect of new Cold War to it, by the fact that they're not just looking at China, they're looking at China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And when you put that quad together, I mean, if you want to get the sort of pheromones or the juices going on US Capitol Hill, that combination drives very little room for pragmatism. And in my kind of 15 years in Washington, don't have the experience, obviously, that Emily does, but my sense is the Hill can be very restrictive on an administration's capacity sometimes to undertake more pragmatic, strategic moves. So as much as Trump may or may not, and I don't know, want to play the pragmatic card, ultimately, I was at an interesting meeting recently of US-China analysts and people who've been in both administrations. All of the focus was on China's weakness right now, on two things. One, China's becoming more authoritarian. It's becoming more the poster child of what you do not want. Not a one-party state, a one-man state. And the risk that a one-man state is inherently more unstable, even than a one-party state, that it may externalize that internal sense of insecurity and paranoia that comes with it. Taiwan, South China Sea, take your pick. So that's one bad bit of news. The other is that the Chinese economy is now suffering, sputtering. So there's two ways of looking at it. Okay, we don't need to worry about them, would be the pragmatic line. But the line you hear from a lot of people, certainly the ones I was talking to, and they represent a cross-section, not Republican Democrats as well, is now's a moment to stick it into China, to take advantage of that moment of weakness, to push back, to be stronger in your commitment to Taiwan, stronger in your commitment in the South China Sea. Now, that may not be what Trump wants to do. I'll be very interested to hear Emily's views on this. But the idea that America's not just up against China, but this kind of axis of evil block animates it. The Chinese threat to American jobs animates it. And ultimately, this idea of China, of the poster child of bad, which is kind of easier to do in some ways with the Chinese than it is with the Russians, let's just be frank about this, makes me think that this is going to be a continuing feature. I'm talking about next 10, 20 years. And it goes beyond the Trump administration. I certainly think Trump will knock it off.
Can I just ask, the point you made about polycrisis and about a world in which Russia owes some debt to China, if you were Xi Jinping, what would you use that support for? Is it necessarily Taiwan? Is it other acts of expansion or influence that we're missing?
I don't know about missing. At the very least, you use Russia as your gas station.
Right.
You try and pull all the energy resources that you possibly can out of Russia. You get that gas and that energy at bottom dollar. If there's anything that you need help with when it comes to votes on the world stage, or, for example, what's going on in Africa right now, Russia is doing a lot to build influence right across that band, right underneath the Sahara, in the Sahel area. Like, that's something that China could definitely draw on. I see it, not to be flip about it, but I see it almost like as a Godfather relationship. Someday I may come and ask you for a favor. That favor could be any number of things, but at the very least, it's economic power. One thing that I heard a long time ago, and I think it's so true in this 10 to 20 year time frame that you're putting out there, I heard somebody say once that Russia is a tornado, China is climate change. And I think that's absolutely true. China is the 20-year, 30-year, 50-year threat. And it's because of the way they've gone about this slow growth, this very smart sort of spread around the world and trying to bolster their own image and gather resources to themselves and then rob companies blind when it comes to their IP. And I think that for the Trump administration, and frankly, whoever comes after him and whoever comes after that person too, the number one goal has to be for Xi to wake up every single morning and say, today is not the day I invade Taiwan. We're not ready. It's not today. And if we can push that day off for 10 years or more, we're all going to be in a much more peaceful world.
I want to sort of round up this bit of the discussion talking about perhaps one of the biggest changes we're seeing, which is the relationship between capital and global competition. And thinking about, for example, green tech, you can see that money is driving that global competition, US, China. Thinking about AI, investment there is kind of politicized, geopoliticized. How do you think investment works, both private and public, within the context of this intensely competitive geopolitics?
One thing I found myself saying to some corporate leaders at various events, supplies maybe definitely to companies, maybe to investment houses. Who are you? Because for a long time, through the heyday of globalization, companies wanted to be glocal, or whatever. We can be everything in all places at all times. That's how we ended up, I suppose, with importing 95% of high-end chips from Taiwan. Whose idea how do you end up with that situation? Never mind where Apple is with still manufacturing the bulk of its iPhones in China. Now, either through the Biden approach, which may return in the future post-Trump, where alliances are made stronger to compete with China, or in the America First approach, where we're taking on China and you better all be with us or you're in big trouble. Either way, companies that are based or are seen to be, or are, in essence, connected to countries that rely on America for their security have to worry about their exposure to direct Chinese benefit into their corporate returns. I can't put it any more clearly than that. Because it doesn't matter whether you're in the high-tech space, you can be. But if something were to happen around Taiwan, maybe not a full-on invasion, take it, some type of blockade or something like that, at the moment, the first thing in the toolkit is financial sanctions. It's the easiest thing to go to. It's where America, for the moment, still has most clout. Could change in 10, 20 years, but for the moment, it's where it is. And so you could be the most ordinary type of company, and you're going to get hit. So my simple answer is, I think, now, if you're a company that does not belong inside the security umbrella, you try to play both sides, as the Saudis are doing, as the Indians are doing, and you will be allowed to. Because in a way, we're both competing, the Russians and the Chinese, the Europeans, the Americans, are just trying to compete to have them on our side. But you can't have it both ways. You can't be inside the America, let's call it, umbrella, and get away with that stuff. You can if you're outside.
Emily?
Right. So I was having a conversation with some of my donors, a very private, off-the-record kind of consulting kind of conversation in about 6 months after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And many of them had made the decision at that point to pull out of Russia entirely. And we were talking through with them what that looks like. Like, how did you make this decision? And then what happens next? Like, let's just say for a second that Ukraine wins or that Russia withdraws or whatever. Do you go back in? And their calculation was really interesting to hear. I love learning from my business partners. They were talking about how when they made the decision to leave Russia, it was very stark. Can our reputation survive this or not? And the answer was no. And then there was a question of what are we leaving on the table? Like, what are our losses really going to look like if we pull everything out immediately? And almost every single one of them decided it was worth it. They were going to abandon the assets they had to abandon. They were going to pull out what they could pull out, and they had just written it off. And on the question of going back in, they said, no, we're done. It wasn't that valuable a market anyway. We're just not going to bother. I said, okay, what about China? If China invades Taiwan? And you could see the I'll just blanch turned, white as white, and they all wanted to throw up, I think. So we had the discussion about what would it take for you to want to pull out of China. And their answer was much more, what we think we would do is probably hive off a Chinese subsidiary, leave that there, and then move everything else we could out of the country, maybe. But this was definitely a prospect they were terrified of. On a related note, I'm working on a project right now, actually, and I'd love your input, those out there who are making these kinds of investment decisions, that we're calling No Front Lines. And it's about the role of industry in modern conflict, looking at things like Starlink's role in Ukraine, Microsoft and the cyber defenders going in and supporting the Ukrainian cyber forces, engaging in hand-to-hand combat with the Russians on Ukraine's networks. At what point are they combatants? At what point are they legitimate targets? Beijing has already said that if Starlink supported Taiwan the way that Starlink has supported Ukraine, that they would consider Starlink a legitimate target. So what does that mean for businesses making these decisions? Further, what does it mean for the host government? If you're the US government and Russia decides to blow up a server farm in Redmond, Washington, is that an attack on the US? Is that an attack on Microsoft? What is the US's responsibility to fight back? So we're doing a project on this right now to grapple with all of those questions and what does the future of business look like with this kind of warfare?
And it is possible that some of those tech entrepreneurs might not answer to their own governments, let alone foreign ones. I can
Indeed.
imagine that's the case. Can I just finish up by asking you one thing? This is a final question to you both. It's been an unbelievably dramatic few days, weeks, months. Can't think of a year in US politics that's been like it. I'm aware we've done a kind of circumnavigation of the globe, but haven't talked about the US and Mexico. we haven't really talked about the relationship between some of those individuals, Washington and the other capitals. How much doesn't change? How much, just finishing up there, how much continuity is there through, if you like, institutions, personal relationships, long-standing cultural ties? Emily, if you'll take the US and Mexico, and Robin, if you'll take the US and Europe.
Yeah. So I'm going to go a little bit off script and say one word about the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, which I think is rock solid and will not change. That's one of those things that has endured and I think will continue to endure. When it comes to something like Mexico, a big wild card for me with this new Trump administration is the extent to which they have the bandwidth to try to accomplish everything they want to accomplish quickly. The first year of a president's administration is when they're in that honeymoon period, they can get a lot done. If you look at Project 2025, if you look at the public statements that a lot of the Trump advisors have made, there are big plans for pretty much everything. But you can only get so much done in government quickly. There are going to be nominations to get through the Senate. There's always more, budgeting procedure than everybody thinks they're going to be. There are elements that are going to slow them down. I don't know if something like a dramatic change with Mexico or other sort of second-tier priorities is going to happen fast. Marco Rubio, as Secretary of State, he's going to have a focus on Latin America. This is going to be the most anti-Cuba foreign policy the United States has ever had. But he's going to be, I think, focused on a lot of Latin American issues in a way that others won't. So I think that bodes well for a strengthening of those relationships. But it really is going to depend on which topic grabs the attention of the guy behind the Resolute desk on which day.
Robin?
I think of continuity maybe in a different way to the way you described it in the question. Continuity, I think, is not going to be continuity, we get the same. It's that it's going to be a continuation of the gradual strategic shifts that have been changing for the past 10 to 15 years. A gradual unwillingness by America to pay as much of the cost of global leadership as it's had to do in the past. A gradual waking up, or it was gradual, amongst America's allies that America wasn't going to be there as much as before. And obviously Trump, too, is an absolute smack in the head that was not an aberration. This is a continuum of change, and therefore a need to adjust. So we're all going to be adjusting. The question is, how does America adjust? I want to believe that history does not repeat itself. Yes, it rhymes, as the famous saying goes. But in the end, to get to the core challenge that Emily was describing before, America's not going to be able to contest with China effectively in the long term without friends. And Europe, in particular, because it also relies on America for its own security, is probably going to be the most reliable of those friends, along with a couple of the other very exposed countries, Japan, South Korea, and Australia. So I'm hopeful, actually, that whatever happens in the next 4 years, and it's going to be very bumpy, the continuum is going to be those countries realizing that they need to hang together or hang divided, to use the famous phrase. So that would be my element of optimism. The only other last element of optimism I'd put in is that the big feature of the next 20 years is going to be engaging much more, competing, China and Russia to a certain extent, us competing for the attention of Africa, Southeast Asia, India. That's the future. That's where the population is, it's where the resources are, it's where the middle classes are. We're aging up in the north. I mean, America maybe not quite as much, but the rest of us are. That is a real opportunity. And I think that's, again, starting now, it's going to continue.
Thank you. I like to think of these Navigating Our World conferences as a collective intellectual property rights violation. Basically, they give us their ideas and then we pass them off as our own. I hope you will agree with me that we couldn't have done better in stealing a bunch of really good ideas from Robin Niblett and Emily Harding, and please join me in thanking them.
Hello, this is Ken Stuzen. Thank you for joining us as we seek out insights that help us better understand our rapidly changing world. We hope you'll tune in for our next Now episode. Until then, be well and stay safe.